Welcome. My name is Jim Rodriguez. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. Again, welcome to this presentation on the neurobiology of resilience. Before we begin, I'd like to say I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a social worker and psychologist, counseling psychologist. But what I hope to do is provide a better understanding of the neurobiology of resilience based on the available literature. So a little bit of background here at the CTAC and at the McSilver Center, we've been interested for some time on trauma and trauma-informed care and its relationship to issues of poverty, and focusing a lot on behavioral health systems. As we've done that work on trauma-informed care and understanding the impact of adverse childhood experiences and the studies done on ACEs, we've been moving more in the direction of identifying and understanding resilience better. And as we go through the presentation, I'll explain why understanding resilience is so important in the context of trauma and toxic stress. But for me, I've always been interested in neuroscience, the neuroscience of the human stress response and understanding the human stress response, and also better understanding the neuroscience of resilience. So that's why I'm doing this webinar today. And while neuroscience is a complex topic and one that can focus solely on individual characteristics, I believe that a basic understanding of neuroscience can actually help us to better understand development in context. And I hope this presentation will better help you understand psychosocial protective factors and the neurobiological basis for some of those protective factors. It'll also help you understand how people, especially those exposed to adverse events and trauma, cope with stress. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about traditional psychosocial treatments and interventions for trauma and toxic stress and how they're related to neurobiology. I'm going to focus on psychosocial treatments. I'm going to speak a little bit about psychosocial treatments in the course of the talk. I won't focus as much on medication and psychopharmacology because there's quite a bit of research on that already. And then lastly, I hope that people will understand the importance and potential impact of neurobiology for alternative treatments and the importance of healthy lifestyles in our treatment and interventions. And these are some of those goals that I want to lay out once again. So quickly, a definition of resilience. The definition that we often use that's out there on resilience is, this comes from the psychological literature. Resilience is defined as a dynamic process reflecting positive adjustment despite significant risk or adversity. And there's two important pieces to this definition. One is, of course, understanding adversity. So when we're talking about resilience, we're not talking about sort of garden variety adversity, stress, daily stress, but we are talking about severe adversity. And by severe adversity, we mean anything that has high odds for maladjustment, things like maternal depression or being exposed to community violence, being exposed to traumatic events, living in chronic poverty, and other risk factors that have high probability or high odds for maladjustment or poor outcomes. And then positive adaptation is the other important piece of that definition, and that's adjustment that is much better than expected given the high probability of the adversity in the person's life. And so given that definition, we view resilience, and this is out there in the literature, as more of a process and an outcome rather than as an individual characteristic or trait. Interesting, though, the neurobiology of resilience focuses a lot on it and the individual, obviously the neurobiological aspects of resilience. And so with that, the term that's typically used in biology and physiology that's related to resilience is allostasis. And that's a dynamic process, a regulatory process wherein homeostatic control is maintained by the individual or by the organism by an active process of adaptation during exposure to physical or behavioral stress. So we do know that there are biological processes that are consistent with resilience, and what research is looking more into now is, again, the social context, the environmental context of that neurobiology, that physiology. So we often talk about, in our work here, resilience as being the other side of the coin from understanding trauma. We know from the ACEs study that exposure to trauma and chronic stress or toxic stress is more widespread than was thought prior to the ACEs study, and we know that that trauma and toxic stress lead to many unhealthy coping strategies and ultimately poor health and mental health outcomes. So resilience in many ways is the study of how people cope with stress and adversity. If we know that external stressors can contribute to the development of health, mental health, and social problems among individuals, then external factors such as treatment and psychosocial interventions can help people cope with, recover, and heal from exposure to trauma and context stress. So that's why we refer to resilience as understanding the other side of the coin from trauma. So if resilience is the other side of the coin from trauma and chronic stress, before we move on, we must understand the human stress response. So when someone is exposed to a stressful or fearful event, this is essentially the human stress response and how the body responds. The amygdala, which is the area of the brain where emotions are processed, especially strong emotions, sounds the alarm. It's sort of the body's alarm system that something threatening is happening. A signal is sent to the hypothalamus, which produces corticotropin releasing factor, which sends the messages to the pituitary gland to produce adrenocorticotropin hormone, or ACTH, which sends a message to the adrenal glands to produce cortisol, which prepares the body for fight or flight. So chemicals such as adrenaline, noradrenaline are also released into the bloodstream, and the impact of that is that respiration increases, blood flow is forced away from digestion into our muscles and limbs, our pupils dilate, awareness intensifies, sight sharpens, pain diminishes, and the immune system mobilizes with increased activation. We're focused on short-term survival at that point. So this is our body's primitive, automated, inborn response to harm or threat to our survival, but it can also be triggered when we experience excessive stress or internal worries or for external circumstances. So even though I said that adversity in the definition of resilience does not apply to sort of garden variety stress, this stress response is in fact triggered when we are experiencing daily stressors, whether that be familial conflict at home or, well, some of these are adversities actually, bullying, problems at work with coworkers, being exposed to community violence or other traumatizing events. So these are the stress hormone, but again, it can occur in the course of daily sort of garden variety stressors. And this response is hardwired into our brains and actually represents a genetic wisdom designed to protect us from bodily harm. It's a necessary response and can be helpful. The problem is that excessive or chronic stress leads to overactivation of this human stress response that can lead to disorders of the autonomic nervous system, things like muscle tension, headaches, chronic somatic complaints, upset stomach, racing heartbeats. All of these things can lead to anxiety, depression, and also contribute to other health disorders such as obesity, COPD. Again, all of this stuff that's been coming out of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So when we talk about the neurobiology of resilience, there are a number of different factors that need to be understood with regards to neurobiology. There's genetic factors, epigenetics, which is critically important to understand in the context of resilience, neurochemicals, and neurocircuitry. It's a complex system. Neuroscience is still trying to figure it all out. So what I'm going to talk about today is just describing these different factors, but there's some emerging research that gives us some clues about how this complex interaction of genetics, epigenetics, neurochemicals, and circuitry can impact resilience. A little sort of primer on genetics first. So neurons, there's billions of cells in the body. Neurons contain the cell body and the nucleus of the cell, which carries our chromosomes, and our entire genetic code is imprinted on those chromosomes. A specific gene is made up of a combination of nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. So our genetic code is set from inception, but not all genes are expressed. For example, someone might have a genetic predisposition for depression that involves a complex interaction of genes, but whether someone actually experiences depression likely depends on the expression of a complex combination of genes throughout the system. There are two processes associated with whether genes are expressed or not. Methylation, so that's methyl groups, compounds of atoms, are added to the DNA molecules that tightly packs them and can switch genes off. And acetylation is acetyl groups that, loosen these the molecules or the space around the molecules and switches them on. This is the basis of epigenetics. So it's important to understand epigenetics in the context of resilience. A nice way to think about genetics, an analogy that I've seen, I've picked it up. This is not totally mine, it's from the internet, but I kind of appreciate it because I'm a movie lover. So the DNA sequence, if you think about epigenetics, you might think about the process of creating a movie. So the DNA sequence would be the script of the movie. The script is written, it's complete. The basic outline of the movie should all be included in that script. The individual cells in our body would be the actors and actresses in the movie. They move things, they make things happen. And in part, the DNA of the script tells them what to do. So the concept of epigenetics actually comes in when you think about the director. So the director can choose or tweak scenes or dialogue and can alter the movie or the script in a variety of ways. The script is still the script, but the director may decide how that script and how the actors play it out. So epigenetics is everywhere. Epigenetics controls genes. The concept of epigenetics is how we control genes. It's everywhere. It's in the environment. Epigenetics is what makes us unique. So when you think about, if you think about a movie and you think about different movie directors, a movie, the same script given to Spike Lee will look very different from the script if it's given to Steven Spielberg, and even more different when it's done by Quentin Tarantino. This is what makes us unique. And also, it helps us understand how the script can be changed. And in neurobiological terms, this is what we refer to as neuroplasticity, that the genetic code is reversible or changeable, flexible, or plastic. And there's many epigenetic factors that can impact the expression of genes, exposure to stress, environmental toxins, the prenatal environment, diet, exercise. The importance of developmental and critical periods when adverse events and traumatic events take place is critically important. And it affects aging, and viruses and infection can also affect gene expression. This is just to tie in epigenetics to this conversation around toxic stress and adversity. So we know from the ACEs study, for example, that a child with 6 or more categories of adverse childhood experiences is 250% more likely to be an adult smoker. The 2 women on the left are identical twins. One is a smoker, the other one is not. So if the genes could not be turned on and off, as epigenetics suggests, right, these 2 women would still look identical at their age. But the fact that they have different lifestyles leads to a markedly different look between the 2 of them. So so going back to the discussion of the human stress response, as I mentioned, there's neurochemicals are heavily involved in this process. There are a number. As I was talking about the human stress response, I talked about the release of corticotropin releasing factor and cortisol and noradrenaline. So there are a number of other neurochemicals, neurotransmitters, amino acids, hormones, and steroids that are produced when people are exposed to stress that impact people's ability to return to some level of healthy regulation. So these neurochemicals can mediate the neural circuits between structures in the brain like the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex, and others that impact cognitive functioning, the fear response, and regulations of awards and emotions and social behavior. So we'll talk about that neurocircuitry in a little bit, but for now I'd like to give you a sense of what some of the other neurochemicals involved in the stress response are, and also involved in the neurobiology of resilience. So as previously described, the HPA axis, that human stress response that I was talking about, that HPA, the relationships between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands, is heavily involved in the human stress response, and many people already may be aware of some of those neurochemicals like cortisol and adrenaline when the human stress response is activated. And just to review, cortisol is associated with increased vigilance and selective attention. It prepares the body for action. Too much cortisol in the body can suppress the immune system, increase blood pressure and sugar, decrease libido, produce acne, contribute to obesity, and more. This is why many researchers and a lot of research has focused on the production or overproduction of cortisol because of its association with stress and the negative effects of it in high doses. But there are some other hormones and neurochemicals involved. DHEA, there's less known about this particular hormone, but it does seem to be associated with stress reduction. So this is also produced during the stress response, and it's associated with stress reduction. And studies show that people who perform better under stress seem to have more DHEA, or a higher ratio of DHEA to cortisol. So it's important to understand this, and I'll talk in a little while why, but DHEA is not necessarily the amount of these neurochemicals that make the body respond differently to stress, but the relative balance of these neurochemicals. So moving into that next sort of column, that next section there in the sympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, is a neurochemical that works a lot like a neurotransmitter under stress. It's produced in the adrenal gland and the brain, and it's the neurochemical in the fight or flight response that specifically helps to focus attention on the threat in a stressful situation. Neuropeptide Y is an amino acid that acts like a neurotransmitter, and it's associated with reducing stress, anxiety, pain perception, and blood pressure. And it is also released during the stress response. But if NPI, neuropeptide Y, or NPI, is not released in sufficient balance to norepinephrine, the body remains in stress mode. So in many ways, cortisol puts the pedal down on stress and increases the body's sympathetic nervous system. But neurochemicals or hormones like neuropeptide Y help to take the pressure off the gas pedal. Galanin is an amino acid that affects cardiovascular and sleep regulation, the anxiety response. It's like NPI in many ways. It affects learning skills, memory, and pain response control. And galanin is also released when norepinephrine is released. Again, in the sympathetic nervous system, it appears that the body needs a balance between the production of norepinephrine, neuropeptide Y, and galanin to function best. And then lastly, moving into so one of the things that's critically important, though, is what helps to, when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, what helps to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the body's rest and digest, feed and breed response. And so that is what in many ways helps people to come back to some sense of balance or homeostasis. So other neurochemicals that are involved include dopamine. Stress inhibits the release of dopamine in the reward or pleasure centers of the brain. So, but stress also activates the release of dopamine in areas of the brain associated with complex cognitive behaviors and decision making. So this explains why when you're under stress, you can't enjoy the simple pleasures in life and you can't think clearly. But it does help to reduce the stress response. Likewise, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that regulates appetite, sleep, feelings of well-being, and happiness. And again, that helps to suppress the human stress response. BDNF is a steroid associated with in the brain, and it's produced in the brain when there's stress in the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And in this case, BDNF can improve or promote resilience by promoting thinking and decision-making and emotion regulation. So low levels of BDNF is associated with anxiety and mood disorders. And allo is a steroid that helps the HPA axis return to normal functioning, so chronic stress can lower the production of allo. And then lastly, oxytocin is a hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus and secreted by the pituitary gland. It's often referred to as the love hormone because it's involved in many activities in human reproduction in women. It's related to contractions and lactation. In men, it plays a role in moving sperm and the production of testosterone. But also, it seems to be produced, oxytocin seems to be produced in the context of supportive intimate gestures, such as hand-holding and other types of soothing physical contact. It also plays a role in the recognition of feelings in others and the development of trust and reducing anxiety. In general, oxytocin seems to be associated or produced in the context of close, intimate relationships with others. So the reason why I'm giving you this sense of an idea, a description of all these neurochemicals is, again, they are produced and can be produced during during the human stress response. But two really important points. First, all of these neurochemicals are produced, and some are involved in the process of bringing the individual back to allostasis or healthy physiology. And the other thing that's important to understand is that many of these neurochemicals can be impacted by environmental factors or lifestyle choices. For example, NPI and BDNF looks like it may be tied to certain types of diets. High protein diets, low fat, high protein diets, or good fat, low protein diets are associated with the production of BDNF and neuropeptide Y. Serotonin is associated with or is produced when people are exposed to sunlight, massage, exercise, remembering happy events. Dopamine is also produced during exercise. Unfortunately, many drugs, especially stimulant drugs, are also produced when dopamine is, are also increased dopamine, and also explains why many people sort of turn to these less healthy coping strategies in the context of stress. And then, so all of these factors, all of these neurochemicals have some connection to external healthy lifestyles choices that people can make that help to increase their resilience to stress. And this might speak to why wellness approaches and healthy lifestyles approaches can be an incredibly powerful adjunctive intervention for folks who have serious problems related to chronic stress and trauma. And in this research, I just want to share this very quickly. So talking about brain circuitry, in this study, 30 research participants were given fMRI scans while exposed to either highly threatening, violent, or stressful images, and then on and off between that and neutral, non-stressful images for 6 minutes each. The scientists found 3 distinct patterns of response to stress. Activation of the brain regions that signal, monitor, and process potential threat, the stress response, increased and then decreased activation of the stress response, and resilient coping. Initially low reactivity of the prefrontal cortex, that area of the brain on the left side, then increased activation, so this flexible neural response. After taking the scans, the researchers asked folks about their coping strategies, what they typically or how they typically cope in life. And the folks on the left are folks who kind of talked about some of the healthy ways in which they cope and having higher neuroflexibility and being able to deal with stressful events in their lives. In healthier ways, folks on the right who engaged in risky coping strategies coped in many ways by things like avoiding stressful situations, smoking, using drugs, other unhealthy ways of coping. And so what this shows us is that in many ways, people's response to stress, those who develop healthier coping strategies, have a higher level of activation in the prefrontal cortex. They are problem solving and trying to figure out ways of coping with that stress when they are exposed to it. We're going to move into the neural circuitry now and talk about that and what that means. So Fetter and his colleagues outlined 3 neural circuits between the various structures of the brain in the brain that mediate emotional states. and can help to foster resilience. And in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about how interventions can play a role in building resilience in individuals. So in order to understand resilience at the neurological level, we need to understand the neurocircuitry of fear. You see that in the red, the neurocircuitry of rewards, and then in the green, and the neurocircuitry of emotion regulation, you see there in the blue. The full details of these neural circuits are not yet fully understood by neuroscientists, and time precludes even a cursory explanation of these, but a quick view of these circuits located in the limbic regions of the brain, I'll talk about that and highlight some important points. As you can see, there are 3 brain structures that are repeatedly involved in these neural circuits: the amygdala, where emotions are processed; the prefrontal cortex, where planning, reasoning, and judgment take place; and the hippocampus, where memories are stored. While stress can contribute to dysregulation of these circuits to promote unhealthy ways of coping and ultimately lead to more physical and mental health problems, resilient coping can lead to more healthy ways of dealing with, promoting healing and recovery from toxic stress and trauma. So for example, in the fear circuitry, just as traumatic or fearful events can be conditioned through the hippocampus, which stores memories, and the amygdala that process fearful events, inhibition of the amygdala by the prefrontal cortex can help to control the fear response. So interventions such as exposure therapy and in vivo mastery have demonstrated effectiveness in helping people learn to control their fears and inhibit the fear response in the amygdala. In the reward circuitry, the nucleus accumbens regulates a person's response to natural rewards and is also involved in addictive behaviors. So we know that people exposed to traumatic and chronic stress can sometimes cope with adversity by using drugs and substances. However, studies have shown that positive emotions and optimism are linked to resilience, and a recent fMRI study by Sharot and colleagues demonstrated that increased activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, that RACC, an area of the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala was associated with imagining future positive events. So this indicates that interventions that help individuals think about the benefits of engaging in healthier lifestyles can be rewarding and help people move towards healing. Lastly, the emotion regulation circuitry involves 2 complex subsystems. However, a number of studies have begun to demonstrate that cognitive reappraisal, or the ability of individuals to reevaluate the meaning of negative stimuli, the meaning of negative events in their lives, involves the capacity of areas of the prefrontal cortex to reduce amygdala activation. This may help explain why interventions that can help people gain some positive meaning in their lives from adverse life events can promote healing and resilience. So interventions like these allow the person to experience the discomfort of talking about or remembering or confronting fears that have been wired in, but in a supportive way that allows them to rewire the neural circuitries of fear, rewards, and emotionality towards healing and help. So this gives you some idea of why our interventions work. I want to stop there and thank you for joining us in this brief description of the neurobiology of resilience. Please feel free to email me at jr4139 at nyu.edu if you have specific questions or if you want information on the references or to request more offerings on this topic. You can also email the CTAC at ctacny@nyu.edu. If you also want to ask for more information or request more offerings on topics like this. Thank you.